In a storage room inside a museum in London, there is a monkey that has not moved in over 100 years. It is not alive, not anymore. It is a skin and a skull, tucked into a drawer since 1913, catalogued, labeled, and quietly forgotten. For most of the 20th century, nobody thought twice about what it actually was. Scientists walked past it. Museum staff dusted the shelves around it. Everyone assumed the case was closed. Then, in 2020, a team of researchers pulled that drawer open one more time, extracted a sliver of tissue, and ran it against DNA collected from droppings gathered thousands of miles away, in the forests of central Myanmar. What came back did not make sense at first, because somewhere on the slopes of an extinct volcano called Mount Popa, an entire species of primate had been alive this whole time, watched by pilgrims, photographed by hikers, walked past by biologists who assumed they were looking at something else entirely. And when scientists finally counted how many were left, the number was almost too small to believe. This is the story of an animal that spent a century hiding from science in plain sight, and a discovery that may have arrived just in time to matter, or perhaps just too late. To understand how a monkey can go unnoticed for 100 years, you first have to understand where it was hiding. Mount Popa rises out of the central plains of Myanmar, like something out of a folk tale. A solitary volcanic peak, long extinct, its slopes covered in dense forest, and its summit crowned by a gilded monastery that clings to a spire of rock. For centuries, it has been one of the most sacred pilgrimage sites in the country, home to the Nats, the guardian spirits at the center of Burmese folk religion. Pilgrims climb its stairways by the thousands every year, past shrines, past incense smoke, past monkeys. That last detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Langurs are not rare animals in the way that giant pandas or Sumatran rhinos are rare. They are, in the broadest sense, common, long-tailed, leaf-eating, tree-dwelling primates found across South and Southeast Asia, split into dozens of recognized species and subspecies stretching from Bangladesh in the west to Vietnam and southern China in the east. To most observers, one gray monkey with a long tail looks very much like another. For over a century, that assumption held. Every langur spotted around Mount Popa was filed under a species already known to science, a population of an animal that had already been named, already been studied, already been understood. Nobody was looking for a new species there, because nobody had any reason to believe one was hiding in that assumption. This is not a rare pattern in primatology. Across the langur genus alone, taxonomists have spent the last 2 decades slowly discovering that populations once lumped together under a single species name actually represent several genetically distinct lineages, some separated from one another for millions of years. A gray coat and a long tail can mask an enormous amount of evolutionary history, and for most of the 20th century, nobody had the tools or the reason to look past that coat. This is precisely the trap that swallows more taxonomy than most people realize. Museums around the world hold millions of specimens collected during the colonial era, shipped back from expeditions across Asia and Africa, catalogued under the best guess available at the time. Once a specimen is labeled, it tends to stay labeled. Nobody reopens a case that nobody suspects is open. The monkeys of Mount Popa were hiding not in some remote, unreachable jungle, but in the plainest site imaginable, on a mountain climbed by tourists and monks alike, simply because everyone had already decided what they were looking at. The story of how that assumption finally broke apart starts not in Myanmar, but in London. In 1913, during the period of British colonial rule in Burma, a monkey was collected in the region, and its skin and skull were shipped back to the Natural History Museum in London, where they were catalogued alongside thousands of other specimens gathered from across the empire. Related tissue samples from the same broader population would later turn up in museum collections in Leiden, New York, and Singapore, each one filed under the same assumption, that this was simply another example of an already known langur species. For more than 100 years, that specimen sat exactly where it was placed. It survived 2 world wars, the collapse of an empire, and the entire modern history of genetic science, all without a single researcher suspecting there was anything unusual about it. It was not lost. It was not hidden away in some inaccessible archive. It was simply unremarkable. One skin among thousands, waiting for a question nobody had thought to ask. That is the strange, quiet cruelty of taxonomic error. An animal can go unnoticed for a century, invisible not because it was hard to find, but because everyone assumed the identification had already been settled. The Popa langur, though nobody called it that yet, existed in exactly that kind of limbo. Alive in the forests of central Myanmar, dead and catalogued in the drawers of London, and, for all practical purposes as far as science was concerned, not a distinct animal at all. It would take a very specific kind of scientific stubbornness, the willingness to reopen a case everyone assumed was closed, to change that. That stubbornness arrived in the form of an international research collaboration, more than 30 scientists working across institutions in Germany, Myanmar, and beyond, brought together by the German Primate Center and the conservation group Fauna and Flora International. Their approach was not to go looking for a brand new animal from scratch. It was to go back and check the paperwork. The team began sequencing mitochondrial DNA, extracted from 41 Langur specimens, some freshly collected in the field, others pulled from museum drawers where they had sat for generations. Their goal was to map the evolutionary relationships across the entire genus, tracing how different Langur populations across Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, Vietnam, and southern China had split apart from one another over millions of years. The broader picture that emerged from that work was striking on its own. Across the specimens studied, the team identified 4 genetically distinct lineages within the wider Langur genus, populations that had been diverging from one another for roughly 4 million years, long before any of them had names humans would recognize. The Popa Langur's story was not an isolated anomaly. It was one thread in a much larger tapestry of hidden diversity that a single genus of monkey had been quietly carrying the entire time. Ask yourself what that actually requires. Not a single expedition into unmapped jungle, but the patience to compare genetic code sitting in a wet lab against genetic code sitting in a century-old museum skin, sample by sample, looking for a signal buried in noise that everyone before them had missed. And in that comparison, one population stood out. The DNA extracted from the century-old specimen collected near Mount Popa did not match cleanly onto any of the already recognized Langur species. It sat apart, genetically distinct, a lineage that had been quietly diverging from its relatives for what researchers estimated to be at least 1 million years. But a genetic anomaly in a museum sample is not, on its own, proof of a living species. For that, the team needed to know the animal in that drawer had a living counterpart still walking the forests it was collected from. That confirmation came from the field. Researchers with Fauna and Flora International, working under primatologist Frank Momberg out of Yangon, collected fecal samples from wild Langur populations living on and around Mount Popa itself. When that field collected DNA was compared against the century-old museum tissue, the match was unmistakable. The animal in the drawer and the animal in the forest were the same lineage. The physical differences, when researchers finally went looking for them, turned out to be real but subtle. A darker, grayish-brown back, a sharply contrasting pale, almost white belly, black hands and feet, a distinctive mask-like face ringed in chalk-white fur around the eyes, slightly larger molars and a longer skull than related species. Differences easy to miss unless you already knew, with genetic certainty, that you were looking at something new. It was assembled, piece by piece, across a wet lab in Germany, a museum drawer in London, and a mountain forest in Myanmar, until 3 separate lines of evidence pointed at the exact same, previously unrecognized animal. For Frank Momberg, the moment the genetics confirmed what decades of field observation had never quite proven carried a specific kind of weight. Momberg had spent years working across Myanmar with Fauna and Flora International, documenting a country whose primates remained, in many cases, barely studied compared to better-funded conservation programs elsewhere in Asia. He had already lived through a version of this exact story once before. In 2010, a team he was part of had identified another entirely new primate in Myanmar's remote northern mountains, a snub-nosed monkey whose most famous trait, oddly enough, was a habit of sneezing audibly when rain fell directly into its unusually upturned nose. That precedent mattered here. It meant Momberg understood, better than almost anyone, what discovering a new species in this part of the world actually tends to mean. It rarely arrives as pure celebration. Alongside Momberg, primatologist Ngui Luen who would go on to lead Fauna and Flora's Myanmar program, had spent long stretches in the field around Mount Popa, tracking Langur troops through forest that pilgrims walked daily without ever suspecting what moved through the canopy above them. The work involved patient, unglamorous observation, waiting hours for a troop to reveal itself, collecting fecal samples not from some remote wilderness, but from a mountain crawling with tourists and monks. Fieldwork like this rarely looks like the dramatic expeditions people imagine. It looks like hours spent motionless in humid forest, binoculars trained on the canopy, waiting for a single dropping to fall in a spot where it could be recovered and matched, sample by careful sample, against a monkey that had been dead in a London drawer since before either researcher was born. There is something almost uncomfortable about how visible this animal had been the entire time. It was not hiding in some untouched corner of the earth. It was living on one of the most visited religious sites in the country, watched, photographed, and completely misunderstood for over 100 years. When the genetic results confirmed the new species in 2020, Momberg did not describe it as a triumph. In a statement announcing the discovery, he said, in effect, that an animal only just described was already facing extinction. That single sentence captures the entire shape of this story better than almost anything else could. The species was formally named Trachypithecus popa, the Popa Langur, after the mountain where its largest known population survives, and the findings were published on November 11, 2020, in the journal Zoological Research. For a moment, consider what that publication actually represented. A monkey collected in 1913, under British colonial rule, in a country that has since seen independence, decades of military rule, and ongoing civil conflict, had finally been correctly identified more than a century later, using genetic tools that did not exist for most of that timeline and would have sounded like science fiction to the naturalist who first packed that skin into a crate. The Popa Langur joined the ranks of more than 500 known primate species worldwide, becoming one of at least 24 new primates described globally since the start of the century. Many of them uncovered through exactly this kind of genetic re-examination, rather than the discovery of some untouched habitat. It is tempting to imagine species discovery as an explorer pushing into unmapped jungle and stumbling onto something no human has ever seen. That is not what happened here, and it is worth sitting with how much stranger the real version is. The Popa Langur had been seen. It had been photographed. Pilgrims had walked past it on their way to a mountain shrine for generations. What had never happened was somebody asking, with the right tools in hand, whether the label already attached to that animal was actually correct. If a story like this is the reason you are here, one that treats these animals with the seriousness they deserve, consider subscribing to Jockingrecht. There is a lot more of this hiding in the historical record than you would expect. Because being formally recognized as a species did not make the Popa Langur any safer. If anything, it did the opposite. Researchers estimate the total wild population of the Popa Langur at somewhere between 200 and 260 individuals, spread across a handful of fragmented forest patches in central Myanmar. The largest single population, the one living on Mount Popa itself, numbers around 100 animals, meaning roughly half of the entire species survives on one mountain, in one forest, within reach of one road network. Sit with that number for a moment. 260 individuals is not a population under pressure. It is a population already past the threshold, where conservation biologists start using the word critical without hesitation. That is precisely the classification researchers recommended the moment the species was described. Not endangered, not vulnerable. Critically endangered, the second most severe category, before a species is declared extinct in the wild, applied to an animal that had, from the perspective of formal science, existed for less than a single news cycle. Consider what that timeline actually compresses. A specimen sits misidentified for over a century. A team spends years cross-referencing genetics across multiple collaborating institutions to finally prove the animal is real and distinct. And within the same announcement confirming that achievement, researchers are forced to state, in the same breath, that the population might not survive long enough to benefit from any of it. This is where the story of the Popa Langur stops resembling a triumphant discovery and starts resembling something closer to a countdown, one that had already been running, unnoticed, for 100 years before anyone even knew there was a clock. The threats stacking up against the Popa Langur are not exotic or unprecedented. They are the same pressures closing in on primates across Southeast Asia, just compressed onto a population with almost no room for error. Hunting remains a persistent danger, both for bushmeat and for the traditional medicine trade that still moves through parts of rural Myanmar. Habitat loss compounds the problem, as agricultural expansion steadily eats into the forest patches the species depends on, fragmenting populations that were already isolated from one another by geography long before anyone knew they were a distinct species at all. Illegal and unsustainable timber extraction strips away the canopy cover langurs rely on for both food and protection from predators, further shrinking the already narrow range this animal calls home. Climate pressures add a slower, but no less real threat on top of these. Shifting rainfall patterns across central Myanmar are already altering the fruiting and flowering cycles many forest primates depend on for food. And a fragmented population has far less room to shift its range in response than a species spread across a continuous, unbroken forest would. None of these threats are unique to the Popa langur. What is unique is how little margin exists to absorb them. A widespread species can lose habitat in one region and persist in another. A population of 260 animals, split across a handful of disconnected forest fragments, does not have that luxury. Losing a single breeding group to hunting or habitat clearance is not a setback here. It is a measurable percentage of the entire species disappearing at once. Myanmar itself adds another layer of difficulty rarely faced by conservation efforts elsewhere. Decades of political instability and, more recently, active civil conflict have made sustained field research and habitat protection significantly harder to carry out safely. Conservation organizations working in the country are frequently operating in circumstances far removed from the well-funded, politically stable environments where most primate conservation success stories tend to unfold. The Popa langur, in other words, was not just discovered too late to avoid a genetic bottleneck. It was discovered inside one of the more difficult operating environments on the planet, for the kind of sustained, patient conservation work that a species this small actually requires. And yet, there is a reason this story is not simply a eulogy for an animal that arrived too late. A decade before the Popa langur was formally described, the same broader conservation effort in Myanmar produced almost the identical situation with a different animal entirely. In 2010, researchers working with Fauna and Flora International identified the Myanmar snub-nosed monkey, a primate living in remote, high-altitude forest in the country's far north. Distinguished by that upturned nose so pronounced that the animals reportedly sneeze audibly when rain falls directly into their nostrils. At the time of its discovery, the Myanmar snub-nosed monkey's population was estimated at somewhere between 260 and 330 individuals, a number nearly identical in scale to what researchers would later find for the Popa langur. It too was immediately classified as critically endangered. It too faced hunting, logging, and the pressures of a country working through instability that made conservation slower and more difficult than it should have been. But within a decade, that story changed direction. Sustained fieldwork, cooperation with local communities who agreed to stop hunting the species, and continued pressure from conservation groups eventually led the Myanmar government to formally designate the snub-nosed monkey's high-altitude habitat. A species discovered on the edge of extinction was given, if not certainty, then at least a fighting chance backed by actual legal protection. That precedent is precisely why researchers working on the Popa langur are not treating its critically endangered status as a foregone conclusion. Whale Win, who has continued working across both cases through Fauna and Flora's Myanmar program, has been explicit that additional field surveys and stronger protection measures are urgently needed if the langur is going to be pulled back from the same edge the snub-nosed monkey was once standing on. The tools exist. The precedent exists. What remains uncertain is whether a country navigating its own deep instability can move quickly enough to apply either of them before the Popa langur's already small population shrinks any further. Think back to that drawer in London, sitting quietly in a museum for over 100 years, holding an animal nobody thought to ask a second question about. That drawer never moved. The monkey inside it was never lost, never hidden in some inaccessible corner of the world. It sat exactly where it had been placed since 1913, waiting for a piece of technology that would not exist for most of the 20th century, and for a team of researchers willing to reopen a case everyone assumed had already been settled. What they found when they finally did was not a ghost, and not a resurrection. It was an animal that had been alive the entire time, walking past monks and pilgrims on one of Myanmar's most sacred mountains, watched by thousands of people every single year, without a single one of them realizing what they were actually looking at. The Popa Langur survived a century of being misunderstood by science. What it may not survive is the decade immediately following the moment science finally got it right. That is the strange, uncomfortable shape of this particular comeback story. The century-long mistake has been corrected. The forest the animal depends on is still shrinking. The population is still small enough that a single bad year could matter more than it should. Whether the next chapter looks more like the Myanmar snub-nosed monkey's protected mountain, or like a species that was found and lost again within the span of a single human generation, is a question nobody currently has the answer to. In 100 years, the mountain itself has not changed all that much. The monastery still clings to its spire of rock. The pilgrims still climb the stairways at dawn. What has changed is that, for the first time, science is finally looking at the right animal. If you want to keep following stories like this, the ones where the discovery and the emergency arrive in the same breath, subscribe to our channel. There are more of these hiding in museum drawers than anyone realizes.